Hello guys, welcome back to another YouTube video here today, and we are going update to over the update over October's update for Borderlands 4, October 2nd, 2025. This is the big patch that we've been waiting for. It's like a big buff update. So the weekly Aqua boss has switched, weekly wildcard immersion has changed, and release black market vendor has moved as we expect. Normal. That's basically pointless to go over at this point. Additional changes, auto added auto clearing of Borderlands 4 stale shaders on version update, preventing performance degradation on some PCs. Now, character balance change adjustments to Harlow had action skill 0 point got buffed. Stasis slam damage is increased by 30%. Stasis immune damage is increased by 14.7%. Which actually, I was actually running this build, so I'm super curious now how this is gonna run. Action skills for Rafa increase the Affle Lance got increased damage by 10%. Capstones people person project Rafa damage now scales by 12% per second, up from 10. Project ballistic damage increased from 15 by 15%. Project ballistic hazard damage increased by 25%. Project Gorgon damage increased by 17%. Passives people person L Carton critical damage increased to 8 from 7% per point. Bonus shock damage increased from to 8% from 7% per point. Per my last double damage chance increased to 6%, 5% per point. That sounds insane. Action skills Arc Knives melee attack damage increased by 12. Dash damage is increased by 5%. I didn't even know you could do dash damage. Straight up honest. I didn't know that was the thing. Passive this year's gimmick handshake deal melee damage increased to 9% from 7% per point. To the last skill damage increased 8% from 6% per point. Paragus splash damage is increased to 9 from 7% per point. Liquidation damage increased by 50%. That sounds collaborative ignition bonus damage increased 8% 6% per point. Signaria duration increased for 14 seconds from 12 seconds. Melee damage is increased from 4% to 4% from 3%. And Impuji, or whatever you say that, action skill duration is increased to 7 from 6% per point. And then we got Vex, action skills incarnate, phase explosion damage increased by 16.6%. Outreach blast damage is increased by 9.5%. Augment Vegetation Energy Vampires increased by 25%. Capstones Vexization Heart Piercer damage is increased by 23%. Desertization Hazard damage is increased by 50%. Desertization Airborne Burst damage is increased by 48%. Guys, Wave damage is increased by 41%. Passes Radiant Attunement now use up to 7% splash damage instead of 6. Dreadlight hazard damage is increased by 100%. That sounds nuts, actually. Arcana now increases skill damage by 9% from 8% per point. Trouble health is increased to 10%. Trouble damage is increased to 21.9%. Here comes Trouble. Violent outburst damage increased by 12.5%. Purple Fang damage is increased by 34%. Trouble bubble damage is increased by 33%, which is the capstone. And here comes Trouble. Passives, here comes Trouble. Blood Magic Flow now increases action and skill damage from 8% instead of 7. Then you got Claw and Bang now increases melee damage by 8 instead of 6%. And then you got passives. Before Steel fell interception and melee damage is increased to 7 from 6% point. Reoccursion now increases melee damage by 0.2% instead from 16 point per point. Hazard of phaser dagger damage is increased by 11.7%. Now we have Amon. We have action skill Scourge. Scourge has has had his maximum vengeance increased by 50%, making him able to absorb damage and deal more damage with Forge Whip when consumed. Forge Whip damage has increased by 27%. The blast chill damage is increased by 45%. Bolton Rebirth damage is increased by 86%. Dude, Aim's got some massive buffs here. Internal Winter massive Forge Whip damage increased by 100%. Stormlance damage increased by 52. Stormlance detonation damage is increased by 10. And then we have the Capstone Vengeance. Glacier Capstone now has 60-second cooldown down from 70. Glacial Rapture Forge Whip damage increased by 16. Glacial Fissure damage is increased by 41%. Wraith full damage is increased by 40%. So then we have passive Scorch Cairo now increase ordinance damage by 5%. Battleborn now increases gun damage by 4 instead of 3. Scar Tissue now increases maximum health and rep kit healing by 9 instead of 8. Eternal now increases action skill duration from 5 to 4. Ward Breaker damage is increased by 50. Winter's Kiss and now increases damage dealt by 10 instead of 8%. Strike the Anvil now deals damage dealt from 12% per point. Forge Wave damage increased by 12%. Double Edged Twin Axe is increased by 10%. Axe and we got Augment Cybernetics. Axe and Stone action skill cooldown rate increase from 40% from 33. Action Stones and Action Ordnance Restoration increased to 40% from 33. Endless War Gun damage taken increased to 20% from 15% prime stack. Hour of the Warhammer Forge Hammer damage increased by 14%. Blade Tempest Forge Wage damage increased by 13%. And then we have Blade Tempest Forge World Detonation damage increased by 4%. And then Snow Maw damage was increased by 38%. Storm Surge impact damage was increased by 10. Storm Surge Forge Storm damage increased by 60%. Flaying Ring Capstone Fire Trail damage is increased by 100. And then we have passive Cybernetic Gathering Storm is now increased elemental damage by 3% instead of 2. Executioner now increases critical hit damage by 4% instead of 3. Destruction Engine now increases Forge skill by damage by 6 instead of 5. Destruction Engine damage now increases detonation by 8 instead of 6. Tempered Power Forged Axle damage increased by 19%. Temper Ice Forge Hammer damage is increased by 18%. Masterwork now increases the Forge damage by 10% instead of 7. Masterwork now increases Forge Drones irritation by 8 instead of 5. Tempered Forged Sword increased by 13%. Lightning Rod Elemental Bolt deals 40% of damage dealt, up from 37% point. This patch is insane, dude. I ain't gonna lie. Patch is insane. Exhalation now increases Forge Drone attack speed and movement by 5% and 3% point. Hone now increases Forge Drone critical chance by 5% instead of 4. Heat Exchange now increases Cryo and is fire damage by 8% instead of 7. And then we have action skills Onslaughter. Onslaughter Shadow Regeneration is increased by 15% per point from 10. Onslaughter Rocket Punch damage is increased by 78%. Molten Slam now has 6-second cooldown from 80 seconds. Molten Slam increased by 50%. Calcimicity Fell Frost damage is increased by 71%. And Fulminant Fist damage is increased by 69%. And then we have Calcimicity Horror Clove has a 55-second cooldown from 65 seconds. Horror Clove damage is increased by 11%. Horror Clove detonation damage is increased by 18%. Boat and Roll has now a 70-second cooldown from 80 seconds. Storm Cutter has now a 65-second cooldown from 75 seconds. Storm Cutter damage is increased by 65%. And we're here at the end here. And passives cast ability, heavy plate now increase maximum shield capacity by 7% instead of 6. Will of the Storm now increases status effect damage and status effect duration by 7% instead of 6. Titanium Knuckles now increase melee damage by 8% instead of 7. Titanium Knuckles now increase skill damage by 4 instead of 3. Harbinger now brings melee damage by 2% per stack, up from 1. And now we have Mortal Flare, damage increased by 22%, and Judgment now increases melee damage up from 10% to 8% per point. Now that is the massive buff patch I can say. It I hope you guys enjoy this video. I'm also gonna leave a link down to another video in the description below. I am doing a Borderlands 4 mousepad giveaway. So if you want a chance to win a Borderlands 4 mousepad, the link to that video will be down in the description below. Make sure you leave a comment and watch that video and how we get you into the giveaway. So, I hope you guys enjoy this video. Make sure you like and subscribe. So.